I'm only vaguely familiar with it because when I read Power and Market, there's a bit of a section in there Rothbard dedicates to the Georges School, but I'm happy to hear more
Oh
about
boy. Oh boy. Okay. Well, Rothbard made some arguments that, um, well, I don't find to be very good. But anyhow, so like basically the idea behind Georgism, it has its roots in the way that, let's say, the earliest classical liberals thought about property. And I mean, in particular, you can go back to the Second Treatise of Government by John Locke to sort of see the source of this. Um, Whereas in the Second Treatise, John Locke, he defines the origin of private property as beginning with, let's say, the application of labor, and the argument is extended to capital as well. The application of labor and capital to natural resources and transforming it into material wealth. Whereas he specifies beforehand that the sort of natural domain, land, natural resources, the natural space, is properly interpreted as common property because no one created it at all. We all need access to it in order to survive, in order to create wealth, and so on and so forth. And he sort of tops off the specification with the Lockean proviso, where he states that sort of after people have appropriated natural resources and are creating wealth with it or excluding it in some way, there must be enough left over and of all qualities for everyone else to be able to access in order to create wealth or to enjoy the returns that come from accessing resources. So from this sort of moral standpoint, what Georges and other classical liberals argued for was, or what they argued is that a tax on labor, and a tax on capital, a tax on exchange and trade can be properly seen as theft of private property, essentially, within this framework. And it's a penalizing of productive effort, fundamentally. But at the same time, what they supported instead, and what they concluded was ultimately the best way to tax, is to tax land value, based on the idea that land should properly be viewed as more as common property. And they also made the argument, many arguments on the grounds of economic efficiency for a land value tax. Because since land is a perfectly inelastic good with no marginal cost of production, a tax on land rent for a single plot of land, or the land price for a single plot of land that captures land rent, ultimately causes no deadweight loss in the market, because it doesn't change any incentives of the landowner with respect to how much land they're going to offer. And because land is inelastic, the value of land is perfectly driven by demand itself. So that ultimately all you're capturing is a sort of landlord surplus from rent. And this would also have a very positive growth effect, because now there's a lot of idle land that's not being used. It's being excluded largely for speculative purposes. That could be opened up for investment by private investors and entrepreneurs in productive activity. It would be something that would increase demand for labor and increase wages as such. And also it would correct the problem that we tend to see of speculative land values, sort of land speculation and driving land prices up, particularly when you consider the effect that discretionary monetary policy tends to have on this. And ultimately, this ends up closing off more and more land from productive use, driving asset bubbles that eventually burst in the form of what we saw around 2007 to 2008. So if I were going to, I would quite strenuously argue that going with this approach, a land value tax approach, would be probably the best way that we could satisfy everyone in terms of in terms of both libertarian principle, since there is a sort of argument from this that I think emerges from a school of thought that was very important to the development of libertarianism. And one that lifts the burden from, I think we would all agree to be the possessors of, the legitimate possessors of private property, being workers and investors and entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. And it's also something I would argue for very strongly on utilitarian grounds. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, maybe.
Well, I understand where you're coming from in that land is a different kind of property that doesn't necessarily require the mingling of labor. I would be hesitant to use the term common property simply because when we think of commons and, as in common parlance with the state right now, common property is often that property which is said to belong to everyone. There is this collective ownership of it. We see quite aptly what Plato described as the tragedy of the commons. And so rather than that land being effectively used by someone who eventually comes to pick it up, or, well, everyone is kept from picking it up, and so the land never gets put to good use. And what I would say about the speculation of land is, I think it's I don't think it's right to conflate the bubble that was created by the 2008 housing crisis with necessarily land speculation. I think that was specifically the housing industry and not necessarily land, although the two aren't totally separate. And I think because land speculation is still necessary, because just like any other commodity or any other resource, there's a time for it to be used, and there's someone who knows how to use it properly. And so if you don't allow the bidding up and down of land prices to see who can best utilize it, then you allow that land to fall into the wrong hands. Because like anything else, property has a price because price is a market signal. And the value of that property will effectively signal to someone out there, some business, that you could use this land for a good purpose at the price it's at now, or no, this land is too expensive, or it's too cheap, meaning it's obviously not good land, something like that. And so I think rather than common property, I think a better term for it would be unclaimed property, because it's just a matter of time until someone actually homesteads it or does something with it till they claim it. And because just leaving it as common property or taxing it into making the use of the land so untenable that production on new land would become nearly impossible, I don't think is a good idea.
Well,
does that make sense?
I could let me respond to some of those points. I mean, in terms of the common property thing, like, I think that the question needs to be asked, and maybe this isn't the time to have the philosophical discussion on it. The question needs to be asked, okay, well, is mere sort of discovery of land or mere purchasing of land, well, let's say mere homesteading discovery of land, is that enough to ethically claim private property rights over something? And I don't think that discovery in general is really the foundation of private property.
Well, I think the act of homesteading would be a bit different than discovery. You're right. I would agree with you. Discovery in itself wouldn't be enough, but I think the act of homesteading is in, not just setting up a fence around a plot of land, but actually, working the land and transforming it in some appreciable way, be it extracting resources from it or actually building something on it, something like that, I think would be a more legitimate way of claiming land.
Well, but I think that in terms of, I mean, when you talk about improving land, I mean, I don't want to tax, we wouldn't be taxing the value of the improvements at all. Um, I mean, I want to go ahead and stipulate that. I mean, what we would be trying to do is tax, let's say, the value of a real estate property that represents a sort of unimproved value in a sense. And I mean, even when you, so like when you homestead and you apply labor to land and make investments in buildings, which I wouldn't want to tax, I mean, you're still excluding a certain amount of value in the land that you're not really utilizing, if that makes sense. And so it still represents, I think, a natural opportunity that isn't really sort of being exploited. So, okay, some other points. There was a lot there. I mean, in terms of like using markets to distribute land, I agree. I mean, I'm not calling for nationalization of land. Let's make that clear. I mean, when I use the term common property, I mean, if you tax something, you're effectively sort of establishing it as that. So, whereas now, I mean, through income taxation, we've established common property effectively to everything, and I think that we definitely want to move away from that. But I mean, when it comes to markets, I mean, speculation in land, the problem with that is that speculation feeds speculation, and you tend to see these sort of spirals in speculation that ultimately will end up precluding land from being put to, let's say, best productive use. The other thing I would say there is that in land markets, I mean, the price of land or the acquisition price of land doesn't always necessarily correspond with who is going to put the land to best use, especially since speculation is one of the things that tends to drive land prices. Also, I mean, it's what puts the land to best use. I agree that the market is the way to sort of is the way to determine this ultimately. But I don't think that speculation is really what we're going for here. I think what we want to see is a market in which land is distributed among people who are going to use it productively, and with sort of disincentives for speculative investment. I think that would be sort of a more organic way of distributing land meritocratically, or let's say a more direct way of distributing it meritocratically. And I mean, the trouble also with land value is, and oh God, I may be about to sort of piss some people off. You're going to think that I might be kind of leftist here. But the other problem with land values over time is that as economies grow, and in particular as technology advances, as opportunities for trade are opened, particularly as international trade develops and you have lots of new commercial opportunities available, you tend to see the demand for land in places where people concentrate escalate to a very high degree. And it's something that ultimately will end up pushing people to the margins. It's something that ultimately ends up massively just sort of skewing the distribution of wealth to a degree that it ends up eating into the returns that people who are engaging in productive activity or who could engage in productive activity are going to start losing out in the share of wealth distribution. And that's not a particularly healthy thing for an economy. I would also say, argue, and this sort of goes back to the question of property rights and sort of justice of exclusion of natural opportunity. When land values go up, so basically like a landowner, when they do things on their land and they're creating value, the value that they're creating isn't really in, let's say, the raw, unimproved land value itself. It's really when communities start to develop around particular plots of land, where economies are developing and people are earning incomes and creating wealth. It's when that happens that land values tend to go up. So, I mean, there's a real argument, I feel like, that when landowners are sort of earning rents, when they're earning returns to land that aren't related to any investments of their labor or capital, that they're ultimately earning returns that they didn't really create and that are accumulating only because of their exclusion of a natural opportunity. That can be argued from, let's say, a Lockean perspective to be a violation of other people's rights. So I feel like that there is a sort of argument for appropriating land rents and distributing them to whatever we feel like that the government needs to do. And also, whenever governments spend money on services, these ultimately end up being captured in land values, whether the government invests in a road or even in something like law enforcement that keeps a community stable, and that makes it an attractive place to do commerce and so on and so forth. Am I making any sense, or?